Let's rise so that we can read chapter 2, verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for him, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins of Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowances. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the woman. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months of preparation, according to the regulations for the women, for thus were the days of their preparation appointed, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went in, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the woman, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the woman, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved her more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight, more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head, and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces, and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai, as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king of Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on the gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. You may have a seat. So we know that verse 1, after these things, has already passed 4 years since the king had vanished Vashti. 4 years, and he's coming back again, now defeated, now not having his queen back at home. And it is believed by historian that Vashti was pregnant. So by this time now, his son or daughter, doesn't specify which one, might have been about 3 to 4 years old. But he's coming back defeated. He has nobody at home waiting for him. So now he's remembering her, and not just like remembering, oh yeah, that girl, but remembering that he lost her. She's no more his wife, the queen. Verse 2 says that the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces for his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful virgins, young virgins, to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given to them. Now, this may sound appealing to the king, because he is believed that he was already in his late 50s by now. So he hears the word young, beautiful, and virgins, so he right away, his ears perk up. Remember, having a party, getting drunk, getting advice from drunks, got up to where he's at right now, having no wife, no queen, no family. And now, more sin is brought before him. Hey, we just had a party, it got you where you're at. Let's have another party. This time will be different. But let's have a beauty contest now. Let's bring all the beautiful young virgins, and you choose a queen. So him again, remember, he's already in his late 50s by now. And they're telling him, choose a queen, a young virgin. Now, Hegai, who is a eunuch, this guy was castrated. Those eunuchs were castrated for a reason, because he was supposed to be in charge. He is in charge of the women that live in this palace. And we'll get into the details as to what these women are doing here. But he was castrated so that he wouldn't be tempted to lay a hand on the young ladies. Now, you can do all kinds of things, but sin, whenever there's sin, no matter what preventative measures you want to take, sin always abounds. I know there's great apps for your phone, for your computer, software for your computer, for your laptop, whatever, to prevent people from going into unwanted or not safe websites, or to see not see certain things. But if you, not you necessarily, but if someone wants to still commit a sin, or see or go somewhere where they're not supposed to, sin will always find a way to get around those firewalls, or those apps, or those whatever. And that could have been the case here too with the eunuch. I'm not saying that's what it was, but that could have been the case. Now verse 4 says, then the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. Now, this may sound like a good plan. Hey, we already messed up before, king, but let's find another way to make it up to you. But see, they're thinking that though he's the king, even though he's the king, once a decree is made, it cannot be overthrown. But him being the king, he can find a way to bring Queen Vashti back, because his servants are looking at him like he really misses her. There's got to be some way, but if they find a way to bring her back, it's going to get them in trouble, because they're the ones who advise the king, get rid of her. So now they're thinking, we already messed up once. And to hide our sin, to hide our faults, let's do something different. And sin does that. We mess up once, and to try to get away with it, let's hide it with something else. So they're saying, let's bring these beautiful young ladies and let's give them beauty treatments. Let's do a beauty contest. Let's see who's the queen, or who will be the queen of the king's palace. The king will be the judge. Of course, he's the one who's going to choose to marry her, and it would have to appeal to him in the flesh, because that's what they were really trying to appeal to his flesh. Young, beautiful, and virgins. And he would have to choose again. And though the eunuchs or the servants seem or think that they're in charge by advising the king certain things, they believe they're in charge, but in reality, though God is not mentioned, he doesn't appear in this book, he's behind the scenes moving all the pieces to the right place. Let me explain. Though this is a pagan country, this is a pagan people, they're not paying any tribute to any god, at least not here. And God is not mentioned because God has a promise to his people. He hasn't forgotten about them. We may forget about God. We may not even pay attention to God. We may not even be in God's will, but he never forgets his promises to us. It's just a matter of us listening and coming back to his promise. And when God's will, we know this because we have the Bible now, we can see that he has made a promise, and though his people after 2,000 years have walked away from him, he kept his promise. He was going to give them the promised land. He brought them to the promised land. He was going to take them out of captivity, and he took them out of captivity. He was going to send them a Savior, and we have had that Savior here already. He never forgets about his people. Verse 5. In Shushan, the citadel, where there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai. Now we get to see the next characters in this drama. Was Mordecai the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Now, back in 2 Samuel chapter 16, we're not going to turn there, but it explains when the people were being taken captive. And we saw this in the book of Nehemiah when they were coming back. The people were being taken captive, and all the people were being warned. They were taken into captivity, not all at once. Micah also warned them. Not all at once were they taken. They were taken first, the people who had more money. Then little by little they came back to you may say, the classes. The wealthy were taken first, and the last people who were taken were the ones who had the least, the poor. So Mordecai's family came along these people that were taken captive. And this Kish was a descendant of King Saul. This descendant of King Saul, if we look back again, if we get a chance, look back to 2 Samuel 16, and he's the one that throws stones and curses King David. after, all kinds of chaos has already happened in King David's family. He's cursing them. So he's a descendant of King Saul. Now, we begin to see that even though, again, they're a pagan people, these people that are here, they're the people who chose not to leave after or go back to Jerusalem after the release of them in captivity. Over 2 million people were taken captive. And we know in Nehemiah, after studying Nehemiah, and if you look at Ezra, that only 2% of these people, about 50,000, actually came back to the city of Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the walls. And this book is a story of those people who stayed behind, who chose to stay behind. I had explained before that maybe they had lost those stories that were passed down by, grandparents or parents themselves, telling the stories of God, what God had done, and they had become citizens of Babylon. They had forgotten their culture. And though they had been freed, they had been given, liberty to go back to Jerusalem, they chose to stay there. They were already out of God's will to begin when they were taken captive. That was the reason why they were taken captive. Because they were dealing with the consequences of their sin, their disobedience. And now, forgetting about God, and again, not going back to God's will. This was another opportunity for an entire nation to go back to God's will. 98% of the people stayed in sin, you may say. You may see it that way too. We know that Nehemiah and Ezra have a burden upon their hearts for the people who actually came back, who wanted to come back, who kept their beliefs alive, who kept their traditions. And even some of the people that came back to Jerusalem came back but leaving family behind. We don't know specifics, but it could have been that the kids that were born in Babylon came, but their parents stayed in Jerusalem, stayed in Babylon, came back to Jerusalem. I said it backwards. Came back to Jerusalem, and the parents stayed in Babylon. Or it went vice versa. In this current country that we live, this current culture, we're losing a lot of those people. You already heard, not only to repeat everything in detail, but we know that this generation that's coming up right now, we've probably already lost this generation to the world. Because, I'll give an example, my wife and I did not learn, and I'm not blaming our parents, it's just that a lot of stuff was not passed down to us. Our traditions from our roots were not passed down to us. We're having to learn them as if it was for the first time. And a lot of you, I'm pretty sure, it's the same. Not that your parents were, not loving to you, but a lot of stuff has been lost. In this current generation, they're being raised without God, or they're choosing to be raised without God. Verse 7. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Now, her parents also were part of probably the last people that were taken captive into Babylon. And though these people are outside of God's will, He never forgets about His people. We don't see that yet here, but Mordecai and Esther are going to find favor in the eyes of God. They're the key players that God is moving. When the first group of people were taken captive, Daniel was one of those people. And he found favor before God because he kept praying to Him. You know the story. He kept praying, and even though they made decrees, they made laws for him to be put into jail, to be thrown into the lion's den, he kept praying to God. We know that Joseph also found favor before God's eyes. It may not seem so. If you were to know Joseph directly, you may not even think so, knowing that he was sold by his brothers, and then he was taken to prison, and then thrown to prison again because of Potiphar's wife. And then he was forgotten in prison. But then in the end we know that that was God's plan all along, to keep him humble, to use him for the right time, as Esther will be used for a time such as this. Verse 8. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now, in the previous verse, said that Esther's original name was Hadassah, which means the hidden one. And Esther means star, which is a Persian name. The hidden one, again, this is God's queen. They don't know it yet. They may not acknowledge it, but they're God's hidden one. God always has somebody prepared if they choose to obey. God has probably been preparing you. You may not be the spiritual giant like Paul was. You may not be the great glory or Franklin Graham. But God wants to use those who are lowly of spirit, which means they don't think of themselves much. They just want to be available, to be used however they want, or however God wants. Josephus, the famous Jewish historian, this is where I keep saying according to history, believe that there was approximately 400 women chosen for this specific thing. And it wasn't that, I'm pretty sure you've seen the movie, that they were lining up to go to the castle and compete against one another. It wasn't that way. It was that they were taken by force from their homes. The parents, knowing that the king was looking for young women, young virgins, they would try to hide them. But they were taken captive by force. And the reason that was, the reason why they wanted to hide them is because once they left, once they were taken by the king, they would never come back home. They will become the king's property. And I'll explain in a few more minutes too. Take note of this too. Esther was also taken. She was taken again and again. She was forced to leave. In the movie, she's portrayed as, oh yeah, I want to go. Mordecai pushes her, come on, you gotta go. It's a contest. And that's not how it happens. That's why, I'm not talking bad about the movies, but you gotta be well versed in what you read in the Bible so that you don't get misinformed. So she was taken, and keep that in mind again, she was taken, because this is going to be key whenever we get to verse 14. Now verse 9, let's keep on reading, verse 9. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her. Besides her allowance, then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and had in her maidservants to the best place in the house of the woman. Now this is talking about future event. It hasn't happened. But to make the story understandable, this is what happened afterwards. Verse 10, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. Again, Mordecai is already out of God's will. And now he's telling her to lie, to cover up who she really is. the way the Jewish people were identified, or once they knew that they were Jewish people, they would know who or what God they actually served. So by them identifying that they're Jewish people, they would know that they served the true God, the true living God. And this was a detestable thing to the king of Persia. But Mordecai tells her, don't say who you are. Don't tell them that you are Jewish. Today, if we are outside of God's will, it is very difficult to witness to somebody. Because you can't, I mean you can, but you will be a bad witness. You can't tell somebody, you know, don't get drunk when you have a beer in your hand. This is an example. Don't steal anything by you taking something from work. You know, don't indulge in food, but when you're not being looked at, you go to the buffet, you know, 3 or 4 times a week. And it's a bad witness. Maybe that's one of the reasons why Mordecai told her, don't say you're Jewish. Verse 11. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the woman's quarters to learn about Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Now, Mordecai was walking back and forth. He was obviously worried. And he probably in his mind, because we know how the enemy is, he wants to take any little opportunity to take advantage of us and ridicule us. He's probably put into his mind, Mordecai's mind, you should have gone back to Jerusalem. You should have listened to Nehemiah. You should have listened to Esther. And now Mordecai is thinking, man, you know, what is going to happen to her? As soon as the king finds out she's Jewish, he's going to kill her. And she's going to be no more. Psalm 46:10 says, be still and know that I am God. Whenever, even whenever we sin, even though we are outside of God's will, if we truly repent, we need to remember this. We need to come back to God and say, God, look, I messed up. I confess I messed up. I need your help. Be still and know that I am God. Whenever you worry, and this, I'm a primary example of this. Whenever you worry, all kinds of illnesses come, you know, at you. Anxiety, headaches, you can't sleep, all kinds of things, and it all attacks your health. Now, Mordecai was walking back and forth. He was worried. What's going to happen? How's Esther doing? Verse 12. Each young woman's turn came to go into the king Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months of preparation, according to the regulations for the woman. For thus were the days of the preparation appointed, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying woman. Now, from the point of view of maybe some of you ladies, you're looking at, man, a whole year spending it in the spa? Yeah, sign me up. But see, this wasn't a regular type of beautifying preparation. We get upset because our wives take long to get ready. You know, we're running late to church. It took 12 months for them to prepare the one queen. And in that culture, that time, the lighter the woman's skin was, the more beautiful, so they thought, was she. So it wasn't just that she was being bathed in perfumes and oils and, you know, scraping off the corns off their feet, you know, their ingrown nails and all that nonsense. It was also that they were, you know, bleaching their skin. Not only that, and we're going to see that in a little bit too, they were given specific diets Because if they were too thin, according to that culture, if they were too thin, they were not beautiful, so they wanted to plump them up a little bit. And there was, again, about 400 young virgins being brought. So there was 399 that were not going to make it. Now, out of this 399, of all these 399 that were not going to be chosen, they could not go back home. They would become the king's property. They could not have a husband anymore. They could not be part of society. They were just his property to be used however and whenever he wanted to. That's one of the reasons why the parents would hide these young girls whenever the king was looking for young virgins. So now you got 400 competing for one place, and 399 of them are not going to get to go back home anymore. And each one of them probably thought, I'm going to be the one. I'm going to be the one that he chooses. Sadly enough, only one was chosen. Verse 14. In the evening she went in, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the woman, to the custody of Shagkias, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now use your imagination here a little bit. She went in to the king's room. She would not come back into the next day. She had to prepare herself for 12 months. She would use or wear whatever clothing she chose to wear, jewels, whatever. She would have to perform for the king intimately. And then come back in the morning, and would not come back unless the king was satisfied with her. So this was happening for 400 women. Verse 15. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the woman, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. The last part of this verse, she obtained favor in all the sight of all who saw her. So, including all the other women, including all the servants, already had in their minds, she's going to be the one. And she chose to take nothing other than whatever the eunuch suggested. She didn't choose no special jewels, no special clothing. In a sense, she was kind of wise, asking the eunuch, you tell me what I should take, since you know the king, what appeals to the king. So you give me whatever is going to appeal, whatever color, whatever dress, whatever jewel he likes, whatever makeup. As a matter of fact, the historian said that she wore no makeup when she went before the king. So that means that she was really beautiful. Verse 16. So Esther was taken to the king into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther. Now it says here he loved, but in other versions, in the NIV, says that he liked her even more than the others. And that's actually a good translation. He loved Esther more than all the others, the other women, because it's a type that he liked lustfully, that he liked her more. It appealed to him more. She obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Now, you can think we have a winner. Yes, we do have a winner. And I'm pretty sure that as soon as, because of what the previous verse said, that she found favor in everyone who saw her, as soon as the king saw her, without her having to perform before the king, he already knew. You know, his heart probably skipped a beat. Tomorrow, 21 years ago, it happened to me. I met my wife. And it wasn't a coincidence. The way I met her was through another friend who asked me, hey, come on over, you want to introduce some girls? And I said, sure, why not? I have nothing else to do. And as soon as I saw her, I told my friend, that one's mine. And it was so. Thank God we're still here. 21 years ago, tomorrow, thank God. And there was no accident for King, or later we'll know that she's queen, that Esther was a chosen one, because God has no chances. It's not like he flipped a coin, hopefully it lands on her, hopefully it's Esther, the one I chose. No, she was the chosen one. She found favor, not because so much the king, and again, this is a pagan king. God is using the sin of this king for God's will. It appealed to him, this queen that God is going to use. Verse 18. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants. Now when we started the book in chapter 1, the book started with a feast. Then there was another feast. And then there was a third feast with Queen Vashti. So there was 3 parties already going on. So now, second chapter, we get a 4th party. But this time is in the honor of Queen Esther now. For all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. So he made a holiday and he gave gifts to all his people. Doesn't specify what kind of gifts, but he fell so madly in love, lustfully, that he gave gifts to all his people. Now, we know that sin led him to where he was at 4 years later. His lustful, his drunkenness self made him do a decision. Well, actually, it wasn't him deciding, he was being told what to decide. And he still can't think for himself, because the people, his servants, are telling him to do this beauty contest to choose another queen. Now you would think that he would learn the lesson, taking advice from drunks, but look at this next verse, says verse 19, when virgins were gathered together a second time, he's already chosen a queen. His lustful self wants to have another set of girls be brought before him. His flesh appeals to him even more. He wants more. He's already chosen a queen. He's got a queen. He's already had 399 women. He's chosen a queen. Now he wants more. It says, when virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now, before I get to what Mordecai is doing here, sin never is satisfied. You're going to have something that appeals to you, and then something else, and something else. And it's never going to satisfy it. Just another drink, just another bite, just another kiss, whatever it is. And this may sound harsh, but there's many times when we put ourselves in situations that we should have never been in. And I want you to understand that I'm saying this not because I'm diminishing whatever I'm going to mention, but we put ourselves in situations, and then later as king, after these things, verse 1 of chapter 2, there was always a later. There's always a later, but that later always is too late. The flesh, the sin, whatever appeals to the person, takes them, it puts them in situations where they should never be. Let's go hang out at the club. Young girls or young men, they want to go have fun. They get into a fight. I wasn't doing nothing and I was just there, so now I'm part of this issue. They get the rape pill slipped into their drinks, so now they end up, look at here locally, Liburnia, if you're paying attention to what's going on in the news, in the high school. All because what? Somebody was having fun. They say, let's take it a little bit further, and it got out of hand. You're driving after drinking, you crash into something or someone, now somebody's dead. I should have never been there, I should have never, exactly, now it's too late. There's always a later, but that later is always too late. I should have never said that. There's some things you can never take back. There's some time you will never get back. Now it says that Mordecai sat within the king's gate. What was he doing there? We don't know what Mordecai was doing this whole time living in Babylon. But again, it's not coincidence that he was there hanging out at the gate. It says, verse 20, now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her. For Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. What was the reason they wanted to kill him? What was the reason they wanted to lay hands on him? We're not told why. But Mordecai hears of this because he's hanging out at this gate. So he overhears this conversation. Verse 22, so the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther. So obviously he had communication, pacing back and forth in the quarters. He had communication and access to Queen Esther. So it became known to Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. So he went and told the king. And when the inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hung on the gallows. And it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. This was recorded, said, let it be in history, that Mordecai saved the king's life. But nothing is told about what, at least not right now, nothing is told that they even told thank you to Mordecai. And he wasn't looking for that. Again, God is using him here. And later on, as we continue reading in this book, we're going to see that he's also playing a part in Mordecai as he is in Esther. Let's pray.